Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to ASPI, and allow me to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people who have been caring for this beautiful country for millennia. For those of you I haven't had the pleasure to meet, I'm Jake Wallis. I'm the Senior Analyst in Information Warfare here at ASPI's Cyber Policy Centre. I have the privilege of introducing and chairing tonight's panel, and its very impressive panelists. Tonight, we are going to be discussing how to counter the spread of violent extremism and terrorist content online. We've seen firsthand how fraught that can be. In the wake of the terrible Christchurch terrorist attacks, we understandably had governments around the world react. A legislative response here in Australia was put in place in the aftermath of the attack, the Abhorrent Violent Material Act, that creates a regime for dealing with abhorrent content uploaded to the internet. The bill creates new offences for digital content platforms and hosting services that fail to notify the Australian Federal Police about video containing abhorrent violent material. The bill creates a regime for the e-Safety Commissioner to notify companies if they are hosting abhorrent content, triggering an obligation to take it down. Platforms can face significant financial penalties, up to 10% of annual turnover, if they fail to remove this content in a timely manner. The bill even creates provisions for negligent platform employees to face prison terms of up to 3 years. The Digital Industry Group here in Australia criticised the bill for being vague on what constitutes a reasonable time frame of response for takedowns and for threatening the employees of companies already working hard to sift through vast quantities of content uploaded to the platforms every second. Some went as far as to suggest that the bill could even threaten the viability of some digital services in the Australian market. Of course, that law is just one piece of the broader picture. There are multiple efforts being made at the platform level and through civil society, by governments and more. To give us a sense of the breadth of the challenge and the responses being tried, we have a wonderful panel this evening. Our three panelists tonight are Vijay Padmanabhan, Rachael Falk, and Matteo Vergani. Vijay leads Google's strategic response team, combating violent extremism and hate speech, and we're delighted to be able to get you out here to speak on this evening's panel, Vijay. I should also thank our partner, Google, for making this evening's event possible. We're wholly funded by supporters here at the Cyber Policy Centre, and we're very grateful for the long-term partnership that we have with Google. Rachael Falk is CEO of the Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre. I think Rachael can lay claim to the lowest carbon footprint for a trip here this evening, given that the CRC is now located just across the road. Rachael is an incredible intellect in this space and focused on very practical ways we can improve cybersecurity. And I'm delighted that you can join us this evening, Rachael. Finally, we have the highly respected Matteo Vergani, who's Senior Research Fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation. Matteo has not one, but 2 PhDs, and has been researching violent extremism and applying that research in prevention and intervention strategies for over a decade. Please join me in welcoming our panel members to the stage. So this evening's event is being streamed live on the ASPI Facebook page, so hello to the audience watching at home. We're also live tweeting the event from the ASPI.org Twitter account, so please do feel free to engage with the event online. In 1974, Brian Michael Jenkins famously said that terrorism is choreographed violence, that terrorism is theatre. On the 15th of March 2019, a 28-year-old Australian attacked worshippers at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. He used a helmet-mounted GoPro camera to live stream the event and clearly understood the power of meme culture. Everything about these shootings, from the distribution of the manifesto on 8chan, an internet forum popular with conspiracy theorists and the alt-right, through his first-person shooter-style gamification of the attack, to his gestures during the court hearings. All of these were choreographed to resonate with very specific internet subcultures. So, as a starting point for the discussion this evening, we might begin with the initiatives that have emerged as a reaction to the shocking live streaming of the Christchurch attacks. The Christchurch call, led by the New Zealand government, has provided new momentum, to efforts to counter violent extremist content online by defining very specific mechanisms to inhibit its distribution. Now, ASPI is a member of the Christchurch Call's advisory network, and the initiatives the governments of New Zealand and Australia have a really significant stake in driving this initiative forward. So let's start there. Vijay, perhaps an industry perspective might be really valuable here. Do you feel that the Christchurch Call has the right kind of balance between stakeholders, industry, government, civil society?
Certainly. And first of all, let me just begin, Jake, by thanking you and thanking ASPI for having me here. It's Thanksgiving in the United States, so happy Thanksgiving to all of you, and happy to be here to have this really important conversation about a subject that I think is very important. The Christchurch Call displayed it as very important. You know, it's really interesting, when I take back to when I first started working at Google on these issues several years back, the situation was we were having a lot of informal cooperation with industry partners on these issues. And then we've been slowly ratcheting that up. I mean, the first thing was we created a database of shared content IDs or hashes so that we could communicate with each other about what we found to be terrorist content to help our industry partners and vice versa. And then that became still more formal in 2017 with the Global Internet Forum for Countering Terrorism, where Google was one of the 4 founding members of that organization. And I think what the Christchurch Call revealed was, though we had developed some good forms of industry cooperation, the reality was that there's more that still needed to be done. And in the crisis moments that followed, there was chaos and really a lack of communication between the different companies that allowed that horrible video to go viral. What the Christchurch Call has done that I think is quite effective is it has developed a crisis communication channel through the Content Incident Protocol that allows companies to communicate with each other and that allows government to communicate with companies. And that's a hugely important channel that's developed here. I can say, looking at the Hala incident, which was, for those of you who are not familiar, another horrible attempt to copycat the Christchurch attack, where the attacker again put a GoPro on, and this time he was seeking to attack a synagogue instead of a mosque, but very similar tactics. We discovered that once this video had been posted to Twitch, because of the Content Incident Protocol, all of us industry folk were communicating with one another. I was on our joint communication channel for about 18 hours that day, hearing from colleagues at other companies, exchanging information, both about the first-person footage and the manifesto, to prevent it from going viral. And while it certainly wasn't perfect, we did not see the same level of virality for the content from Hala that we had seen from Christchurch, which I think is due, at least in part, to the effectiveness of this kind of communication channel. So I know that this was the first invocation. I hope it's the only invocation. As a realist, I know there will be more invocations of this protocol, and it'll get better, I think, as time goes by.
Rachel, do you have a view on that, on the makeup of the stakeholders that are engaging, particularly in the Christchurch Call, in developing specific mechanisms that inhibit the flow of this content, specifically around really high-profile events?
Look, I think absolutely I agree that I think it's brought together a channel of quick crisis communications, and having spent a lot of my career in large organisations, it can often be very difficult to get messages up to the right level quickly. So it's absolutely a great step forward. I think absolutely not a criticism. I think that the broadening of that is we all understand what the Christchurch call is. We understand the means by which it's an effective mechanism to remove offensive content expeditiously. It's sort of, the message probably needs to be a bit broader around why do people, there's a spectrum of people who watch that content, and not all need to be radicalised or want to be terrorists. It's, to me, getting back to probably the younger generation who some of it would have watched it because it was there and not because they want to be terrorists. It's around a values thing too, around getting the message out that you just shouldn't watch it for a whole range of reasons, because that is someone's loved one. That is a tragic, abhorrent event. And it's almost that sort of compelling car crash kind of video thing where this is just a thing where cyber's the conduit, and it allows those kind of shock and awe tactics to be bounced around the world quickly. So where something might have been quite contained once, and in, the terrorism of the 1970s was incredibly contained, you have a situation where exactly that, it can resemble real-time shooting games, it can almost appear like it's not even real, and that has an attraction for an element of society you probably game a lot, so with the gamification. So again, it's a values thing, and about a society that we do need a law clearly that has a test of expeditiously. But beyond that, what kind of a society wants that kind of, and I have heard some people saying, organisations saying it's freedom of speech, it should all be up there, but what kind of society, any society we want to live in, and we remember we're talking about the worst of the worst, abhorrent, violent material, would want to access and watch that material. And I think that's a values question. It even goes beyond the law, is we need to be having conversations with our kids. We need to be talking about that. We need to also talk about the fact that these videos aren't just in the darkest places of the dark web now. They come up and these are deliberately out there. You don't have to go looking hard to find them. What we can thank is the platforms for being able to stop them from becoming viral. But the tragedy is what might have been in a dark and hidden corner of the dark web or the internet is now becoming, first place, a tactic of the person who wants to gain notoriety. They don't even need to be associated with a particular doctrine. It is out there. That's my fear, is that we need to start talking about almost a conversation. Just because it's there, prior to takedown, does not mean you need to see it, copy it, send it, share it.
So these kinds of initiatives need to be about more than technical fixes. They need to be about a reassertion of values.
Yeah.
They need to be about media literacy.
Yeah.
Matteo, what do you think of the mix of stakeholders in the Christchurch call? As someone who's been involved in establishing programs to prevent and inhibit violent extremist philosophies.
I think it's, of course, the Christchurch call had a positive effect, and it's a positive step. But, only for the sake of the argument, I'll be a little bit critical about a couple of things. So first, civil society organizations around the world, actually mentioned that the Christchurch call does not define very well violent extremism and terrorism, which is a problem, because if it's a global call, well, you can imagine governments, authoritarian governments, that can use the Christchurch call to remove content that smells of opposition in their countries. So this is one potential issue. Civil society was not consulted a lot, which makes sense, because it was really a quick reaction to an enormous problem, and there was no time to have a real consultation, but it didn't happen. And some civil society groups say, well, there could have been an emphasis on human rights in countering terrorism and violent extremism a bit more. You can say yes, but you understand that if you want to bring on board the largest possible number of countries, highlighting human rights too much can be a potential issue, dividing the table. So, there are a lot of complications, and it's clear. nonetheless, it's clearly a very important step forward. There is also a whole discussion that maybe you want to talk about later about, is removal always good as a counter-terrorism strategy or not? Or there are negative effects, but that's a whole different conversation.
But it's a really interesting point, because one aspect of this space that I did want to talk about was legislation, and legislation that's defined nationally but has to cover a kind of global, interconnected, networked environment. And I know here in Australia we introduced the Abhorrent Violent Material Act quite swiftly after the Christchurch attack. And I'm wondering if legislation like that, particularly from an industry perspective, perhaps to start us off, Vijay, does that kind of legislation provide or create the appropriate incentives for platforms like Google to engage with governments on these kinds of problems?
Yeah, I mean, first I'll just say the former human rights professor in me is excited to hear you, Matteo, talking about human rights, because I think we don't use that language enough in technology, and I do think it's an important part of how industry thinks about approaching these questions. Going to the question about AVM, I think, to me, the most important thing is that as companies, we share, or at least Google does, shares the concerns of the government about this type of content. We don't want it on our platforms, right? We don't want to host it on our platforms, I think, most importantly. So in that sense, the aims, I think, are quite common. I think the challenge is writing legislation that is technically feasible for companies to be able to implement it. I mean, so one thing that's challenging, I think, quite frankly, about AVM is that it imposes a strict liability regime on companies. And it assumes, thank you, and it assumes the fact that companies are going to be able to identify and remove abhorrent violent material from our products automatically. My team works every single day with machine learning, both matching and classifiers, to identify problematic and abusive content on our platforms and remove it. And what I can tell you is that our machine learning is not at a place where we're able to find all of that content without being notified. We can find a lot of it, but not all of it, right? And so I think if you're looking at legislative ways for the government to encourage companies to be responsible, I think there are other regimes that we've seen in other parts of the world. For example, a notice and removal regime, where competent authorities in a particular country identify the content, notify the technology company of the content, and have an expectation of action within a time that's specified by legislation. That type of legislation, I think, is much more reasonable and realistic with existing technology than one that tries to impose strict liability on a company for presence of the content on the platform. And I'll say one last thing to go to Matteo's point about human rights. If you have a strict liability regime, and that is just what's left in place, companies will be forced into over-censorship, right? Which is to take down anything that's even in a penumbra around violent content. And I think that's one of the concerns that we would have at Google as a company that was founded on free speech, right, is to have legislation encouraging us to take action to avoid legal action by the government that would dissuade legitimate speech from being on our platforms.
Rachael, do you have a view on the legislation that we introduced in this country? It was swiftly introduced following the attack.
Sure, no. So just to explain, strict liability means once it's on your platform, ergo an offence has been committed. So it's sort of like, don't pass go, no defence, you're liable. Look, it's a start. It's certainly a bold piece of legislation. Australia led the way with it. Devil's always in the detail and the operation of legislation, there's no doubt about that. And that's why we have 7 judges on the High Court and lots of case law, because we're always slicing and dicing legislation and the finer points of what it might mean and how it plays out. The legislation contains a test about expeditiously. Now, one person's expeditious is another person's not so expeditious. What does expeditiously mean? Well, we know that in the Christchurch case with Facebook, the Attorney General said 69 minutes is too long. So we know that when we talk about Facebook, there's sort of an inherent conflict there. I do struggle to understand why it took so long when Facebook censors women who've had breast cancer and putting photos of breasts up on mastectomies. I don't understand that. They've got machine learning of a sort to detect some but not others. I think what the point of the legislation is, it's absolutely right. It may not be perfect. It may not be the takedown. I think the idea is also that it is putting companies on notice once you've been told, the clock starts ticking. How you've been told might be a matter for debate. The other thing about the legislation is it's important to understand that telcos and ISPs and people who host don't always want liability. They want to be able to say we were imposed an imposition, we were legally obliged to take it down. We don't want to have to make that decision. So from a legal perspective, it's easier to have a piece of legislation so that an ISP can say, or a platform can say, we were bound by law, irrespective of the human rights issues and legitimate, but we were bound by law to take that down. Now, one could argue that if it was human rights or others, there could be a reasonableness test to put it back up because in fact it wasn't abhorrent violent material in that form, it was other things. I think the thing is with legislation, I always bring it back to first principles and if it happened to me, I'd be really honest, if one of my family members was killed that way, would I want any of you in that room viewing it as some sort of spectator sport? Absolutely not. And we have to remember at the heart of this are families who are deeply affected not only by the acts of that day or those events, but deeply, deeply traumatised because it's played out and played out and played out as if it were a spectator sport for other people. So I've got no issue with legislation because I'll always bring it back to if that was my family, if that was my loved ones, absolutely I want to take it down like now. I also think the platforms, and you can speak to this, platforms will become a legal issue too down the track. It's not yet recognised at law. They don't want to become liable for any cyber harms or any harms that may result from the constant viewing of that piece of footage. The law in Australia at the moment doesn't recognise nervous shock in that form. It doesn't recognise that kind of harm. But in time, I would suggest it will. And it could be argued that down the track, nervous shock caused by seeing your loved one tortured or killed in that way could be something that a platform does not want to be exposed to those damages because they've become a publisher. We've also heard that platforms are going to be regarded more and more as publishers, certainly in a defamation context. So I don't know where the law will go, but it's certainly something that I'm sure Samantha York at Google and others do turn their minds to on occasion to wonder where will this end up. So I think that legislation's a start. It's not perfect by any means, but it does mean that there's a quick chain up. It puts large organisations, it also imposes an obligation on large organisations to have an ability to deal with this quickly. You can't underestimate that in large organisations, picking up the phone, emails, people are lost, people move away, people are on leave, things can get lost very quickly. So having a really quick avenue up is a really important thing when seconds matter to removing content.
I'm going to ask one more question on the Christchurch call, primarily to you, Vijay, and I apologise for putting you on the spot. It's because I think we really value the industry perspective that you bring, and I also want to make sure that we have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the event. So what I wanted to get into was really around those cross-industry mechanisms that have emerged, like the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, like the Content Incident Protocols. Are they, from an industry perspective, are they sufficiently robust to inhibit these kinds of events from occurring or from them to prevent them from having the reach that the Christchurch video had?
So I think the answer to that is complicated. Obviously, and I think we've all agreed on the stage, the Content Incident Protocol is an improvement from where we were before, right? Mm-hmm. Having companies talking to each other about what they're seeing on the platform when they see links from other parties, other companies on there, that's been very helpful. Excuse me, apologize for the cough. It's been all the travel. But what I will say is the Content Incident Protocol works only for companies that are part of the Global Internet Forum, right? And I think what we've seen is that there are array of smaller companies who are not part of the Global Internet Forum, either for resource reasons or in some cases because of their philosophy, where they have issues with the idea of content moderation or content removal. And so the reality is, I think it's very important to remove the content from the big players like Google, because it is a form of brand advertising when it is on our products. but that doesn't solve the problem entirely because you may still see this content appear on smaller platforms. And I think one other thing that's worth noting, and Christchurch was a very good example of that, is that Google operates in a much broader ecosystem, right? And tech companies certainly fell down on the job, no question about it, when it comes to Christchurch. But traditional media as well had some issues associated with making challenging decisions about when to put up particular kinds of content, when not to put it up. And so I think that to think that any kind of tech industry action in and of itself is going to solve the problem misses the broader array of actors in the ecosystem.
Let's try and broaden it out a little now.
Yeah.
Matteo, do you think there's a danger that the framing of the problem becomes skewed and that rather than countering violent extremism, we just don't want to see it?
Well, in a way, yes. And if you allow me, I come back to the point that removing content is a good thing because it takes out the oxygen of publicity to the extremists. It definitely removes them from the mainstream. I mean, we know that when you remove content, the content pops up somewhere else, but maybe in a more hidden place, which is good because it doesn't, it's not, close to the mainstream society, but at the same time, it's more difficult to monitor. If you think about, of course, social media intelligence and open source intelligence, it's risky because, look, yes, it's not only a problem of, the video of the Facebook, on Facebook of the attack. It's mainly a problem of the rest of content. So I'm thinking, for example, in this moment about the concept of hateful extremism. There was an interesting report of the UK government talking about hateful extremism as a broader concept, which includes idea like making the moral case for violence or justify violence in broader terms. So sometimes this is below the threshold of removal in any platform. However, it has an impact. It brings people towards a worldview that can become dangerous. So, I mean, if we only focus on certain extreme cases of extreme violence, yes, we definitely miss the point, which is much broader.
I mean, what springs to mind is really the emergence of internet ghettos, like environments like 8chan that are not particularly pleasant places to be. Is there a way by design that we can create a more cosmopolitan internet that will pull in these kinds of environments, these spaces? Tough question, hey?
Look, I think it's the very nature of the internet and the way it does have not just ghettos, but suburbs and streets and laneways that just, some of them are fine and open and sunny and others are very dark places. And then I think you're right, it's not just the shock and awe of the visual here, it's the manifestos, it's the written word. And then when does it become censorship? I think the difference is here is how much of the online content in a graphic sense radicalises or changes people versus manifestos which seek to absolutely convert people to a way of thinking or have sympathisers, which is different. Look, it's a tricky one because there's a balance of free speech. Are you entitled to write anything? But then it's when it tips into calling for action, tips into inciting crime, and then obviously we do have laws to deal with some of that. And each country is different as to what people can say. I think it's certainly coming to be that the consumers are wanting more intrusion and activism from digital platforms. So no longer is there a case for them to sit back and go, we're not touching it? US law might allow us some protection, but I think consumers expect a more interventionist approach. But it absolutely is a fine balance between what should be on the internet and what should be there. Because let's face it, you can take it off, as we've said, you can take it off major platforms, but that's the nature of the internet. People will then repost and go to darker places. And and that's just an unrealistic option. And then you do become a repressive state if you want to try and grab everything. I think, again, sort of getting back to one of my earlier points is, why do people seek out some stuff? You've got to ask your question, why do they seek it out? What's their motivation? What are the societal factors that mean people are seeking out, can be radicalised quickly, are seeking out these not just dark corners, these dark suburbs in the internet where they're finding, for whatever reason, sympathisers, like-minded people and doing what they need to do. And it seems to me that not only do we focus on the sort of the one end of the spectrum, you know, alt-right is now emerging as another place. And it seems to me also that in some cases you don't even need to stay in the dark suburbs very long to find a friend, find many. And now they're even creeping out into Twitter and mainstream places to spread hate. So spreading hate is not new. I think it's the conduit of the connected world that makes it just have that, again, that mass ability to be out there and be present. I can assure you that probably many people in the late 1930s and 40s in Australia probably didn't know much about Hitler's manifesto because it just wasn't known. Today, we'd all know about the manifesto pretty quickly.
That's right. And Vijay, we know that the mainstream platforms are willing to engage in forums like the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, but there are many platforms and hosting services that are not willing to engage in those cross-industry structures that try to drive some mechanisms that prevent the flow of this kind of content. Do you feel like there's sufficient coverage across the industry, or will there always be a periphery that allows a channel into the mainstream?
Well, I mean, you know, here's the story, right? The mainstream platforms can only control ourselves, right? You know, one thing I always say is, you know, we have such a large problem in sort of sorting out how we're doing things at Google ourselves that our ability to sort of focus on what the broader industry is doing is limited, right? So really, that's where it comes down to governments to decide, like, what is the appropriate boundaries for speech in different societies. You know, I'm an American. Our First Amendment is very powerful, and it recognizes really wide-ranging levels of speech. I was also a former human rights professor, and I used to teach the European Convention on Human Rights and the way the Europeans go about doing things, where they do a much more balancing test and allow governments to restrict certain kinds of virulent speech. And those are just very different models to approach the problem. And I think it's really ultimately incumbent on our elected representatives to decide how they want to balance between those different values.
That's right. So, Matteo, are we developing sufficiently effective interventions, both online and offline? And what does success look like?
That's a fascinating question because we don't know. That's amazing, because actually it's very clear, and there is probably one of the only things where academics agree, there is consensus, that we are very bad at evaluating.
Okay.
So there are no real frameworks shared to conduct evaluations, and when there are frameworks, for example, there is one in Australia, but it's not really used. So we don't follow that framework. And by framework, I mean a shared understanding of how we measure success. Because if we have it, we can build cumulative knowledge, we can compare different initiatives, the effectiveness, understand where, when we do something, it's effective, in which context, etc. We don't have that. So we as a society, or a extremism, counterterrorism practitioners, we measure different outcomes in different ways that are uncomparable, and therefore we don't really know. And also, let me tell you that I think the metrics that are most commonly used to measure counter and violent extremism online are really bad. Because, for example, I see most of programs measured, for example, looking at how many engagements there are from the public. So I don't know, a strategic communication piece of content sent out online, how many times it's viewed. This is a very, it doesn't tell you anything about who is watching it, whether this person watching it changes idea, whether maybe you are, communicating a piece of content that for your target audience is actually counterproductive, and you don't know, you have no idea. So we continue to use the wrong metrics, and ultimately we don't know how a successful CV program online looks like.
Is there anything from the cybersecurity research that we can apply here, Rachael? Is there any metrics or approaches that are particularly helpful, do you think?
I was just listening to Matteo going, he's absolutely right. Evaluating research is hard enough and the impact of research. So evaluating this research is really challenging because you're not necessarily going to have people who are, unless you can get to sort of every convicted terrorist and say, how are you radicalised? Tell us where you clicked, what you did, and that may be some of the research. It's really, really challenging.
You can't trust them.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and they, and so it is a really talent. So no, in short, the answer is I'd love to say yes, but a plug for research generally, cybersecurity or not. The good long-term research takes years. 3 years, 6 years, and because Christchurch legislation came about so quickly, we kind of think these problems can be solved really quickly. And then a plug for research, it just can't be. It needs long-term research, 3 to 6 years to probably do some good studies. I'm sure we'll find some grants for you. It's about that application, but about having the ability to take time, and that's really hard in a world that moves incredibly quickly to be able to slow down and say, we actually need to take time to do this well. We can give you something, but it may not have any absolute value at all. Because unless Matteo's going to go and visit the supermax prisons around the world, which I'm sure you'd love to do, to talk to the hardened sort of terrorists who will then talk about how they became radicalised, and I'm sure that some probably do happily talk about it. Others die, so they're not very helpful. But it's important that whilst that's a very valuable piece of research, it's understanding exactly, balancing also that we can have a platform overseas that will not recognise our law at all. And in fact, some of the bad ones, at least ACHAM was, I think, hosted in the Philippines. That's where you look to other channels, the diplomatic channels, the economic channels, and it's a really whole of government response then. It's a whole of government response saying we don't like the fact some countries may host sites that we think are not in our interests. So it's also getting other countries who, you say, may not be able to afford to become part of fora, may not have the ability to respond. It's about helping them understand that this is a global challenge, not a national challenge, and coming to it. So I'd love to say, I've got a great project I can talk about or a great magical metric, but unfortunately, like cybersecurity research in this area is long, painstaking, takes money, lots of good researchers who have the time and patience and some real innovation around, as you say, so that when we are shutting down content or removing it, we're not removing vital content that may need to be there. As to your point, Matteo, sometimes you don't want to remove content. I'm not suggesting the violent, abhorrent, but you don't want to remove printed material because maybe your interest in other people seeing who looks at the printed material, maybe an invaluable source. And I'm sure some printed material may not be put there by terrorists at all. Yeah. It may be put there by others who want to be, or all sorts of other reasons to put material there. So it's a complex world we live in.
And I think, of course, Vijay, you don't have the luxury of time to develop metrics.
Well, again, it's so funny because I, as I said, I came from an academic background, so I completely appreciate the points that the colleagues are making. I think when you think about what does success look like here, I think you've got to break it down between what does success look like for companies and what does success look like for society, right?
Absolutely.
For a trust and safety operation, I think industry can continue to do better, ourselves included, in traditional trust and safety metrics, right? Which is we want to make sure that we take down content before people see it. Yeah. And that's what we hold ourselves to, right? So we can get better at discovering content, we can get better at reviewing content, having better people looking at it, better trained people looking at it, understanding context. So we can continue on that path and will. But I think there's the broader question that you all are raising that I think is a good one, which is, here's the reality. The best trust and safety department in the world is not going to be able to remove every piece of terrorist content, every piece of abusive content before anyone sees it, right? That's just not possible. Well, the way I like to think of it is in a lot of ways, we're like antibiotics, right? But the bacteria mutate, right? They don't stay the same. And so we have to keep evolving our defenses. And then the question then becomes, how can we ensure that our users are empowered when they find this kind of content on the internet, not to start going down these ghetto bubbles, as you were talking about earlier, and be able to be resilient in the face of toxic content? Yeah. The good news is, again, going back to academia, there's a lot of fascinating research that's going on in cognitive psychology, for example. And Google is always looking to find these partners in academia to work with and test different types of theories to ensure that our users can access information and utilize that information in the safest way possible.
Okay. So I can tell that we've got a highly engaged audience here who are not exhausted having done a day's work and come to an ASPI event. So I'd like to, at this point, open it up for questions. Who would like to ask a question of the panel this evening? And if you don't, I will completely abuse my position as chair and take the first question. Hey.
Harley, is it on?
Harley, just tell us where you're from, if you don't mind.
Harley from Home Affairs. Obviously, this question's not from the government. Just from Vijay, you were talking before about the challenges with taking content down. Recently, Sacha Baron Cohen did quite a good speech at the ADL, and he said in that speech that he wants to see publishers like Google slow the production of content down, not just publish everything as soon as someone clicks send or share. What would be your response to that proposition from Sacha Baron Cohen?
Yeah, so I mean, the first and foremost thing with everything related to Google is scale, right? And so when you think about the idea of Google moderating, so YouTube is, I think, is the product that you'd be talking about in this context. So if you think about YouTube moderating every piece of content that's uploaded to YouTube, I think it's like billions. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but we're talking about an enormously large volume of content per minute. And so the resources that would be required to be able to do something like that go far beyond, what we would expect to happen. And the other thing is that the vast, vast, vast majority of content is non-abusive. I mean, one of my colleagues at YouTube always puts up this pie chart which shows the 99% of the content is non-abusive, and then you have this tiny sliver of 1% of content that's abusive, and then when you get into this type of abuse, we're talking about a really small amount of content. And so to move to a system where you would essentially have pre-moderation of all of the content would be to slow people's access to 99% of this non-abusive information. And I don't know that that would be the most efficient use of resources. Instead, I think where I think it's more promising is our technology is getting better and better to help us identify which pieces of content we think are likely to be abusive, and therefore send those particular pieces of content to manual review or even prevent their upload entirely. One really exciting thing is that at YouTube, as soon as we find a particular video to be terrorist content, we don't allow the re-upload of an exact copy of that video again onto the platform. And that's an example of how we can utilize knowledge of abuse as opposed to penalizing all of those who are putting up content from being able to do so.
Thanks for your question, Harley. Any questions? Elise.
Hi, I'm
Elise from... Elise, would just hang on for the microphone, please.
Hi, I'm Elise from ASPI. I wanted to ask about the redirect method, which was a pilot program which Google ran with a company called Moonshot CVE, which sort of was directing people who search for specifics. Well, you can probably explain it better than me, but
I can. Explain it. I can explain it.
Well, it was as I understand it, it was a pilot program which was directing users who search for specific search terms to content that would hopefully help to de-radicalize them. And I suppose my question was, firstly, how did that pilot project go? Will it be expanded? What were kind of the metrics that you used to evaluate whether or not that was successful?
That is a really good question. So the redirect method was actually developed by what was called Google Ideas, is now Jigsaw. So it's actually part of our Alphabet family, but not actually within Google itself. But as you really did do a very good job of explaining, the idea behind the redirect method is that there's actually a lot of information out there in the ecosystem that counters radical narratives. And part of the problem is that it's really easy to find radical information and really hard to find information countering radicalism. So the idea was, well, what if we use an advertising program, use terms that somebody would look for on search or YouTube, and look for content that's radical in nature, and then serve them an advertisement that has text that's a little bit unclear in terms of what the goal of the advertisement is, to entice them to click on it. When they click on it, you would end up at content that is countering a radical perspective. The program is one that was innovative. It's kind of a first of its kind attempt in the field. I think some of the points that were made up here hold very true when it comes to these kinds of programs. We can measure things like average watch time. We can measure click-through rate. And those are measures that tell us something about engagement with the content. What we can't really measure is why are people engaging with the content the way they are. And that is absolutely a research challenge that we face and that this method faces. And so one thing that we decided to do was open source all of the methodology. So all of the research that underlies the method is all available online. And so governments, private companies, foundations have all utilized this methodology and are engaging in different kinds of research efforts around it. And our hope at Google is that what will come out of that is greater information for the industry about how counter-narratives may work. The other thing I'll say is that we at Google are not resting on the redirect method. We're continuing to think about what are other kinds of interventions that we can partner with government, that we can partner with civil society on, and test ways to improve resilience for our users and empower them to be able to use information on the internet more usefully. And so I think we'll see more and more of those projects. We hope we'll see more and more of those projects come to fruition in the years ahead.
Is there anything you can bring to that, Matteo, in terms of interventions or the evaluation of interventions, both online and offline? I mean, is the question just like, let's try and stop this content before it reaches the internet?
Okay, I'll make a general point about how to evaluate the impact of alternative content. Look, maybe I am very common sense, but we need to ask people. So let's say if, I don't know, we have people who, and I'm making it very, very simple, and I apologize, but let's say we have people who are radical or have extremist ideas on a range from 1 to 10, I don't know. If we want to engage with people from 8 to 10, the most radical, let's not do campaigns, right? Or maybe even alternative content will not really work very well because they are already into their bubble and they will delegitimize unless it comes from a very trusted source, basically anything. So you can do other things with them. You can give them services, mental health support, whatever you can. But let's not try to change their ideas. For the rest of the people, maybe we can identify samples or groups in society that have similar ideas, and we can show them the content and see how they react. We can do randomized controlled trials, we can do focus groups, we can do other things, but we can basically, with the toolkit of our research methods, ask people what they think of content instead of looking only inside the screen, maybe.
It sounds like we need more of the research that Rachael was talking about earlier. I might just flip to the audience,
Sure.
Because I really want to make sure people get the chance to ask questions if they want to. Yes, up at the back.
Good afternoon, Martin Lander from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I'm off the clock, so my comment are mine alone. And happy Thanksgiving Day. Look, this is very interesting. I think we need to keep in mind that what is abhorrent is not the filming, but the actual act. And is there a risk that by focusing on this particular issue and any kind of alleged moral impropriety by people watching it or uploading it as being the main issue, I would be concerned, and I would guess a lot of Americans would be concerned if, in order for Google to be put in the unenviable position of regulating what goes up, given the amount of volume of material that gets uploaded every second, that somehow we are outsourcing essentially value judgments to an organization, and you'd have to kind of divest or invest your officers, your content managers with decisions to make yes/no decisions very quickly. it would simply be both unreasonable for Google, but perhaps also, again, giving an organisation what are essentially perhaps moral reasons. Would you not argue that the Hindenburg disaster photograph would be something equally abhorrent? Or for that matter, the picture of the napalm girl from the Vietnam War? You could argue that these are also evocative and distressing. Where do you draw the line, but how do you also draw the line, and how do you prevent other governments, perhaps, for example, when we had the Innocence of Muslims videos, the Charlie Hebdo, where they had other people who had probably good justification to say that those images were abhorrent. How would you possibly manage this?
Well, this is the challenge.
Yeah.
That's your day job, isn't it, Vijay?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So I think that you make a very good point. I mean, so first thing that I would say is that obviously there are judgments in this space that it is appropriate for government to be leading with, right? I think that's your point here, and government can place important guardrails on how corporations engage with content, which the AVM law is one example of it. I don't know if it's the most effective version of it, but there are other versions of it also that are happening across the world that are important. But the reality is, even if governments do put those guardrails around the edges, every company that is a content company is going to have to make judgments about what content they do want to have on their platform and what they don't, right? That is just the nature of it. Even deciding that we will not have content policies, that's a judgment, right, that is being made about what's going to be on there. And so what we have long recognized, and the violent material is just one of many, many contexts that we have to deal with these questions, is we are every single day addressing really complicated, value-laden, balancing questions about what should be allowed on our platforms and what shouldn't. And I'll give you one example of that, is that we have something called an educational, documentary, scientific, and artistic exception to a lot of our product policies, which means that the same content, if it is put up by a news agency or if it is put up for the purpose of academic exercise, we may allow the same content that we would otherwise not allow if it was put up for a different purpose. But we don't extend that to moment of death footage. So we've made the decision that though we want to allow academic commentary, we won't allow news footage if a newspaper decides to put up the moment of death, which sadly did actually happen with Christchurch. We saw some newspapers choose to go down that path. That's where we drew the line in terms of our EDSA. So I bring up that only to just say that we recognize that to some degree, our content policies are always going to involve these kinds of value exercises that you're talking about. We're trying to do the best job we can. We don't always get it right. And we spend a lot of time evaluating the decisions we've made and then trying to recalibrate them. And then all of you in the room here play an important role in that process as well, right? Civil society and academics do a really important function in commenting on the decisions that companies are making and the decisions government are making, and holding our feet to the fire in a way.
So we've got 5 minutes left. Let's see if we can squeeze in, I don't know, 2, maybe 3 more questions. Brief questions and brief responses, please. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you for the presentation. As Google becomes more...
Sorry, could you tell us who you are and from ANU?
From ANU.
Welcome.
As Google becomes more sort of invasive in terms of Google Home, Google cameras and those sort of things, if it becomes aware of people searching things or particular conversations, trigger words, whatever, going on, would there ever be an ethical reason for Google to start reporting that or start handing that through to law enforcement, so that if they know someone is becoming radicalized, that they might prevent that before it actually happens, rather than getting to a stage where there is radical material or whatever that is uploaded?
So it's kind of the pre-crime question.
No, I mean, our privacy of our users is actually one of the paramount values at Google, right? So certainly we're not going to be listening to people's conversations that are happening in their own home and using that to report that back to the authorities. What we do have is something called a credible threat protocol. So if, for example, on a YouTube live stream, we have somebody make a credible threat to their own life or the life of another, we will have an immediate report of that situation to law enforcement, so law enforcement can address that issue. We have that available on other products as well. We see it most often happening on YouTube live stream. Would be a situation where you would see that occur, and obviously we would report that to the authorities. But I mean, the idea that Google would be sitting and listening to you through Google Home and then reporting that content to the police, that's not going to happen.
I think maybe some agencies might want that power. But I think what you're going, or departments, is pre-crime, and pre-crime then becomes a very Orwellian term. Then you start to get into sentiment monitoring at work, and sentiment monitoring your, Google sentiment monitoring emails, and then whilst I agree, it might sound like a great thing to, but if we then have this sort of middle ground where somebody might commit a crime but they haven't yet, then they're in a purgatory, which hasn't even been explored legally. But you're right, though. One could argue, with all this data we're amassing, wouldn't it just be so easy to then pick the? I'm being deliberately provocative, but you could see a repressive regime, particularly going with all this data. We could then start to see the hallmarks of someone who might go to commit a crime. Should we intervene? Should they be singled out? Should they get special services to de-radicalise or help them? It's one level one could say, wow, that we could prevent crime. Another level, it's just so creepy that it could happen, and scary.
Can I say 5 words? Our predictive models are very bad.
Yeah.
It's a good point. Okay, I think we've got time. Maybe one more question, which I might ask if no one else has one. So I'm really interested in the emerging synthetic media, deepfakes, automated text. Do these pose new challenges for platforms in terms of the kind of content that you're having to detect?
Yes. I mean, that could be the one-word answer that we could close out on here. Absolutely. These, we are very aware of the threats that are developing here, and they are not a different kind of threat in kind.
Yeah.
We've seen these kinds of things exist for a long period of time, but the degree is the danger, right? We're seeing much more sophisticated fakes happening, which become harder and harder to detect. So what I will say is that Google and other technology companies are working diligently to improve our defenses so that we're going to be able to detect fake content and to try to avoid our platforms being abused by nefarious actors. But the reality is the incentive for bad actors to want to develop this type of fake content is immense. And just like I mentioned earlier in my bacteria antibiotics analogy, that is just as apt in this context as it is in the previous one, right? And so we will continuously work on evolving our defenses. But the reality is that no matter how good we get, these nefarious actors are going to continue to try to do things that we have not predicted yet. And so we will then have to catch up with our technology. And so what does that point to? Ultimately, that points to the fact that we need to be empowering our users to have the skills that they need to be able to question content that's trying to manipulate them. And I know one thing that we're doing here in Australia is we're sponsoring media literacy programs. And I think there is nothing more important than these style of programs that are designed to give users the tools to be able to handle this content, even as we work very diligently and hard on improving the quality of our defenses.
So I think this is a conversation that we should continue, but perhaps over a glass of wine. The kinds of themes that are emerging for me is that these are fundamentally human problems that we need to think about reasserting human values within technology and not relying on technology to fix what are essentially human behaviors. I also note that it's a kind of complex system. These are problems that aren't going to go away, and we're going to have a kind of adversarial approach with malign actors who want to kind of manipulate and exploit the openness and the cosmopolitan nature of the internet and all the benefits that brings. But on that point, I think I'd like to once again thank Google for sponsoring the event this evening. It's been a fantastic discussion. And ladies and gentlemen, before we go for a glass of wine, please thank our panel.
Thank you. Thanks very much.